Good evening, everybody. This is a public information meeting for the proposed South Geneva Historic District. Tonight, this is an informational meeting that's provided for those of you who are either within the proposed historic district area or adjacent to it. So I'd like to begin with introductions. I'm Michael Lambert. I'm the Preservation Planner for the City of Geneva, and we also have David DeGroot, who is the Director of Community Development. That would probably be a good reminder for all of us. I'll check my own too to make sure our telephones are set to silent or vibrate, please. So the purpose of this meeting this evening is to provide to all affected and interested residents of Geneva accurate and complete information regarding the details of the proposed South Geneva Historic District. As a reminder, this is set up as an informational meeting and is not a forum at this time for the debate of or solicitation of testimony regarding the merits of the proposed South Geneva Historic District. That will be provided for all interested people during the public hearing, which will be scheduled later on this spring. The agenda for this evening will begin with me providing an overview of the evolution of Geneva historic districts, what the requirements are to nominate a historic district, the nomination process itself, how public comments will be received and handled, what the rights are to object to the proposed South Geneva Historic District, the impacts of designation, the commission review process, the probable review timeline for the consideration of the nomination, and then at the end we'll provide a time for questions and answers about the process itself. So the evolution of Geneva historic districts has a long history. It dates back more than 40 years, and it was the goal of the original group, which was comprised of members of the Geneva Historical Society and the Geneva Chamber of Commerce, to preserve the architectural character of the Geneva community. And in the original notes, it was identified that the quaint charm of Geneva had been noted throughout the region as early as 1895. So Geneva's had a very long and proud recognition of its historic buildings and neighborhoods. In 1979, the group listed the first historic district in the National Register of Historic Places. That's the Central Geneva Historic District. And then followed that up in 1982 with the North Geneva Historic District. It is interesting to know that the original goal was to establish 5 historic districts, according to notes that I've reviewed. And that answers the question for some people why there's a Central Geneva Historic District and a North Geneva Historic District. The intention was there would be a West and East and a South Historic District eventually. In 1982, the first Geneva Historic Preservation Commission was formed. It was one of the first in the state of Illinois, and Geneva was on the forefront of the preservation movement in the state. In 1987, the local historic district was established and incorporated both National Register districts as well as additional areas bounded by Stevens Street on the north, the east bank of the Fox River, 7th Street on the west, and the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad right-of-way on the south. Also in 1987, the first historic preservation ordinance was adopted by the City of Geneva. In 1995, the original historic preservation ordinance that was written in 1987 was updated. And in 1999, a reconnaissance or windshield survey was completed for all of the buildings located within the Geneva Historic District. A reconnaissance or windshield survey is a survey that's based strictly on the visual characteristics of a neighborhood. It does not include much research. And based on those the visual information collected, the buildings were ranked within the historic district by different categories. In 2006, the City of Geneva hired its first preservation planner. And between 2006 and 2018, 7 individual properties within the City of Geneva were identified and individually designated as historic landmark properties. Those individual properties all lie outside of the identified Geneva Historic District. Between 2015 and 2016, a consultant reviewed the 2 National Register districts in Geneva and reviewed them to see what had changed in the intervening 4 decades since they had been listed. That information was requested by the state of Illinois and filed with the National Park Service as an update to the Geneva Historic Districts, and it did result in the change of boundaries of those 2 National Register districts. In 2016, following a 2-year review process, the Historic Preservation Ordinance was updated and adopted by the City Council with new rules and regulations, and that's one of the reasons we're having the meeting this evening, because one of those new obligations in the Historic Preservation Ordinance is to provide a public informational meeting for all residents who may be affected or impacted by a proposed historic district. I mentioned that in 1999, a windshield or reconnaissance survey was completed of the current district. This is a map that's color-coded to the various properties within the Geneva Historic District. And the colors represent the different types of property categories that were identified. The 1999 survey identified properties either as significant, contributing, or non-contributing. Excuse me. Each property category determines the level of evaluation by the Historic Preservation Commission when reviewing proposed work for compliance with the Secretary of the Interior's standards for rehabilitation. Non-contributing properties are reviewed at a minimal level. Contributing properties, which make up the majority of all properties within the Geneva Historic District, are reviewed in greater detail, and significant properties are reviewed at the highest level of detail for proposed work. Currently, staff is completing an updated survey of the Geneva Historic District. It's an intensive survey which includes not only visual inspection of each property, but also historical research on each property so that the architectural and historical significance can be weighted for each property. In 2008, the City of Geneva adopted a historic preservation plan that identified approximately 50 individual sites as well as 2 potential districts that merited additional study for consideration of historic designation. These sites were all outside of the adopted Geneva Historic District. One of those areas that was recommended for further study was an area along South Batavia Avenue between the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad and the southern boundary of Geneva. The 2011 proposal for the South Geneva Historic District was investigated by staff in response to a stated objective of the Geneva City Council. At that time, proposed boundaries of a study area were developed by city staff based, again, on a windshield type survey of the neighborhood identified here and bounded by the red line. No formal nomination of a South Geneva Historic District was ever developed or adopted. The proposed boundaries extended north and south along Batavia Avenue to incorporate the majority of the individual historic landmarks south of the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad that had been nominated since 2006. The southern boundary of the proposed district in 2011 did not extend as far as the Riverbank Laboratory property, which was the only landmark south of the railroads not included in the proposed district. The most recent designation of a historic landmark is located at 810 Dow Avenue and actually lies on the far western edge of what was proposed in 2011 as a district study area. However, many property owners at that time within the proposed district expressed objection to the survey of the area. As an agenda item in the strategic plan for the City of Geneva, the proposed survey for a South Geneva Historic District was discussed at the City Council's Committee of the Whole meeting. Based on neighborhood response to the proposed district, the City Council voted to remove it as one of the council's objectives in 2011. The 5 landmark properties that lie within the proposed boundaries of the South Geneva Historic District as proposed in 2011 incorporate a wide variety of building materials and represent several distinctive architectural styles. Furthermore, mature vegetation combined with the rolling terrain and waterways leading to the Fox River establishes a unique neighborhood setting along Batavia Avenue. So that brings us to the proposal in 2018. The proposed 2018 South Geneva Historic District is approximately 30% of the study area that was proposed in 2011. The present proposal for a South Geneva Historic District was not a city council or staff initiative, but instead resulted from a neighbor-to-neighbor initiative to protect the historic character of a small area of South Geneva. Neighbors inquired about the designation process in July of 2018 and submitted a nomination on November 21st of 2018, so it was not a quick process. The proposed boundaries are visually logical based on the stated period of significance and description of neighborhood character as stated in the nomination document. As a point of interest, the boundaries of the proposed South Geneva Historic District may be expanded in the future if additional properties are both contiguous to the adopted boundaries and also meet the criteria set forth in the submitted nomination. So what are the requirements for a historic district? Per the updated Historic Preservation Ordinance, the properties that comprise the proposed South Geneva Historic District must be contiguous and lie within the corporate boundaries of the City of Geneva. The proposed South Geneva Historic District must be visually homogeneous and incorporate properties representative of the identified period of significance as identified in the nomination document. Collectively, the properties must possess integrity of design, materials, workmanship, and context that establish a sense of a particular time and place in Geneva. Also, the properties comprising the district must be at least 30 years old in whole or in part. A proposed historic district in Geneva requires that it include at least one historic landmark property. The 2018 proposal for the South Geneva Historic District actually includes 2 historic landmark properties: the Queen Anne Cottage at 716 Shady Avenue and the Henry B. Fargo residence at 316 Elizabeth Place. Excuse me. Also, as requirements to nominate a historic district, the properties in the district must possess one or more of the following characteristics as identified in the Historic Preservation Ordinance. The properties must have a broad association with the historic development of the nation, state, or community. Properties must be identified with a historic person or event in Geneva. Properties must have distinguishing architectural characteristics. Properties may be a notable work of a master builder, designer, or architect whose work has contributed to the development of the Geneva community. There must be distinguishable architectural or land use characteristics of the properties nominated. The area that is nominated may be subject to detrimental influences, or the properties may have a significant threat with demolition, or the properties may be in an area with qualities and characteristics that are deserving of designation in the judgment of the Historic Preservation Commission. Yes?
You mentioned that it could be expanded if it met all the characteristics. I don't see that this was a voluntary effort. I don't see the requirement for homeowners of contiguous properties in the future to volunteer to be part of it. Am I misunderstanding? To be included in it if you were not now, would you have to volunteer?
Yes.
Okay, so you cannot, homeowners or in contiguous properties cannot be pushed into. That's not true. We did not
So
volunteer.
I will, if I can, I would like to address all the questions at the end if possible. So I will address the contiguity issue. Again, very timely segue, but the boundaries of the proposed South Geneva Historic District may be expanded in the future if additional properties are contiguous to the adopted boundaries and meet the criteria set forth in the submitted nomination. There is no requirement for adjacent properties to join a district, but they do have that possibility and that potential. What it would require is basically another filing of an amendment to the nomination and filing the appropriate documents and submitting a fee, and then it would be considered in the same process as the original nominations being considered with a public hearing and findings by the commission.
But that could be done over the owner's objection?
No, no. An individual property would have to request to be added to the district. If a group of people want to add to the district, there is the potential that a property may be included to provide contiguity for the other properties. And again, I can describe that in greater detail as I answer questions at the end, if that's acceptable. And some of these questions that you may have may be answered as we go through the entire presentation. That's why I'd like to keep questions to the end if possible. The nomination process itself. As identified in the Historic Preservation Ordinance, there is a series of steps that must be completed excuse me, in a specific order to have a nomination considered for in front of the Historic Preservation Commission and then recommended to the City Council. Those steps are a preliminary inquiry or pre-application meeting, the filing of the nomination, the notice to adjacent and impacted property owners that a nomination has been filed, staff review and comment of the nomination, a public information meeting, which we're having this evening, revisions to the nomination submitted by the nominators, the scheduling of a public hearing, and then based on that public hearing, City Council review and action, and then actually recording the ordinance with the Kane County Recorder. To date, the following items have been completed. The pre-application meeting was held in July of 2018. The nomination was filed, as I mentioned, on November 21st of 2018. The notice of filing was distributed, which is the reason most of you are here this evening. I have completed my review of the nomination as it was submitted and have returned comments to the nominators for revisions. And tonight we're here having the public information meeting to provide information to all interested parties.
Excuse me, I'm sorry, I know you said you want to hold the Q&A
Yeah.
for beyond, but you're stating there that everyone who lived in contiguous area of that district has been notified?
Yes, we have letters were sent by certified mail to all addresses on file at the Kane County's Recorder's Office.
I have received nothing.
Well,
I'm on the corner of Eastern now.
I will check the list that was generated, and I can talk to you afterwards and make sure that you're on the list. We did get 4 letters returned as undeliverable, so I can check to see if you're one of those at the conclusion of the meeting. So public comment for or against a proposed historic district is taken at a public hearing. A public hearing, for those of you who have not ever attended one, is a special kind of public meeting that provides an opportunity for all interested individuals or organizations to be heard in an orderly fashion regarding support for or objection to the proposed South Geneva Historic District. Testimony may be provided in regard to the nomination in general or may address specific components of the nomination. The nomination is available for public viewing. It has been on file since it was submitted, is available here at City Hall during normal office hours. It is important to note that sworn testimony must be truthful, concise, and non-repetitive, so that the record is accurate, but also the meeting continues to move forward in an orderly fashion. Everybody has an opportunity to speak who wishes to. At the public hearing, the Preservation Commission may continue the public hearing under certain conditions. However, the commission must make a recommendation to the city council within 45 days of the closing of the public hearing. The Historic Preservation Commission may continue a public hearing for several reasons. One may be that the hour is getting late and there are people who still would like to speak, and the commission may continue to allow everybody to be able to have an opportunity to speak at a reasonable hour. The commission could also continue a public hearing because they feel there's additional information that they have not received that they would like to have in order to consider the nomination. And if the commission does continue a public hearing, it has to be announced at the time of the public hearing of when the meeting will be reconvened, so everybody is aware of the date and time of reconvening and the location. Once the public hearing is closed, when the commission deems that all people who've had an interest in making a statement for or against the nomination, the commission will take a motion to close the public hearing. At that time, there will be no more public input for or against the nomination from any other individuals or organization. At that point, it's up to the commission to deliberate over the testimony that's been presented and the information that's been provided in the nomination to make a determination or recommendation to the city council. As I said, once the public hearing is closed, the commission must make a recommendation to the city council within 45 days, and that is per ordinance. So there's a lot of information available on the public website for the City of Geneva. I have the web address up here. And if you go to the Historic Preservation section and look up applications, you will see in the lower right corner there is a document that you can access for historic district or historic designation objections. That is a two-page form that must be filled out completely for it to be valid. The forms may be filled out online and then printed off at your convenience, or they can be printed and completed by hand. There's no requirement they be completed by computer. To be considered valid, an objection form must be completed by each owner of the property. So if you own the property individually, you are required to have one objection form. If you own it jointly with a spouse or a partner, then you need two separate forms for that property. And if it's owned in a trust or there's multiple owners, each of those owners needs to fill out the objection form. All sections of the objection form must be completed, including the signature, and it must be notarized. For those of you who don't have access to a notary, we have notaries available here at the City Hall on a daily basis. Incomplete objection forms or objection forms that are completed but represent less than 51% of the owners of the property are considered invalid per the ordinance. So again, if you own a property in joint tenancy and you own it 50-50 and one owner says yes and one owner says no, it does not qualify as a valid objection. It needs to be at least 51% of the owners of the property objecting. Objections to the nomination may be filed up to the close of the business day of the meeting at which the City Council votes on the recommendation of the Historic Preservation Commission. So it's a wide open window of time at which you're allowed to object. It can be done as, if you want to object and you're an impacted property owner, you may do so tomorrow, but you also have all the way up until the process gets to the City Council. If less than 20% of the owners of parcels of property included in the proposed historic district object to the designation, then the City Council may approve designation of the historic district by simple majority of the sitting aldermen. However, if 20% or more of the owners of parcels of property included in the proposed historic district object to designation, then the City Council may only approve designation of the district by a 2/3 majority vote of the sitting aldermen. I do have printed objection forms available after the meeting if anybody would like a printed copy this evening. The impacts of designation and the commission review process. In the short term, the major impact of designation is that no building permits will be issued within the proposed South Geneva Historic District until the Geneva City Council votes to accept or reject the Historic Preservation Commission's recommendation regarding designation of the area. So that means if a building permit was not submitted before November 21st for properties within this proposed area, those permits will not be reviewed or acted upon until this matter is decided by the City Council. In the long term, the impact is important to note that existing zoning rights are preserved. Historic preservation designation does not eliminate any of the zoning rights that go along with the property per the zoning ordinance. What is reviewed is exterior work that's visible from the public right-of-way that also requires a building permit. If the work does not require a building permit and it's not visible from the public street, then it is not reviewed by the Historic Preservation Commission. The Commission's review of work that is proposed is based on a series of 10 statements known as the Secretary of the Interior Standards for Rehabilitation, as well as policies and guidelines adopted by the City of Geneva. The Secretary of the Interior Standards for Rehabilitation was developed by the National Park Service and is used across the nation as a standard guide to evaluating projects for historic compatibility and appropriateness. The city has adopted several policies and guidelines. Two of the policies the city has adopted are the window replacement policy and a siding policy that govern how new materials or how historic materials may be restored and how new materials may be utilized in historic properties. All of those documents are also available on the city's webpage. There is a section of the Historic Preservation website identifies property rehabilitation information. If you can't get to the historic preservation section, you can just search property rehabilitation information in the city's main search box, and it will bring you to this page. And on this page is listed all of the review documents that the Historic Preservation Commission follows or requires for submittal. Some of the items on this page are not necessarily preservation specific, but they are zoning issues that are reviewed as part of a preservation proposal. So questions that have been asked over time and some fairly recently as to what the impacts of having a historic district and what the review requirements or what the review issues may be in front of the Historic Preservation Commission. One of the ones I hear most frequently is, are paint colors regulated on properties located within the historic district? The simple answer in Geneva is no. While there are some communities that do require paint approval, in Geneva it does not. Geneva requires only review by the Historic Preservation Commission if a project or a undertaking requires a building permit. Painting also is also considered a reversible alteration, so you can paint a building a multitude of colors and you can change the look of it, but it's not harming the essential form or character or materials of the building. However, there are things that that are color related that the Commission does review, and those are elements of architecture that are either semi-permanent or permanent in nature. Examples of that would be stone or brick cladding or metal roofing or some other material that's intended to be a relatively permanent and non-changeable color that may have an impact on the overall character of a building or a property. Is landscaping regulated within a historic district? Again, because we are permit-driven, landscape plantings do not require a permit, and so therefore plantings are not regulated within a historic district. However, certain landscape features and elements may be subject to commission review because of an identified historical association with a specific property. For instance, if you have a historic fountain or a historic gazebo that is part of a nominated property, that would be included in review by the commission. However, in general, walkways, driveways, patios, decks, fences, signs, gazebos, trellises, arbors, pergolas, fountains, swimming pools, etc., all landscape features, are not reviewed necessarily for historic compliance, but as part of the historic review are reviewed for general compliance with zoning regulations in the city of Geneva. Can the Historic Preservation Commission require certain improvements be made to a property? Again, only work that is proposed by a property owner and that requires a building permit and that is visible from a public right-of-way is subject to commission review. So although the Historic Preservation Commission cannot compel an owner to undertake specific projects, the Geneva Property Maintenance Code is upheld by the city's code enforcement officer, and when dealing with historic properties, we often collaborate on an appropriate direction for correcting a property maintenance issue. Can old windows be replaced with new windows? That's probably the question I get the most on a regular basis in my office. Window replacement depends upon a lot of factors. Historic windows are critical features of most buildings and typically are not the greatest contributor to energy and efficiency. The City of Geneva has adopted a window policy to guide the rehabilitation and replacement of windows in historic properties. If historic windows are deemed reparable, the Commission will work with the property owner to preserve the historic windows wherever possible. However, when older windows are allowed to be replaced, new units must match the dimensions and details of the historic windows, whether made of wood or clad in a low-maintenance material. However, it's important to note that certain types of window materials cannot replicate the proportions or dimensions of historic windows, and therefore those types of replacement windows are not allowed for use in a designated historic property. Are solar panels allowed in the historic district? Existing solar panels would be allowed to remain and can be replaced and maintained as warranted. Requests to install new solar collection systems would be reviewed by the Historic Preservation Commission only if visible from the public right-of-way. Preferably, new solar panels would be located on a roof plane that is not visible from a public street. Those that would be visible from a public street due to the necessary location for collection should be designed such that if removed in the future, the essential form and features of a historic property or building would be left unimpaired from their original condition. Additionally, solar collection systems that are the least invasive visually and structurally are preferable. As the solar industry is evolving, there are many, many, many types of solar collection systems out there that are compatible with historic properties. Are contemporary additions and buildings permissible? The Commission seeks to preserve existing buildings as products of their own era, and to that end, the Commission also encourages additions and infill construction to be examples of our own time as well. The Commission's often chastised that they want to only have old buildings and have everything look like it's old, but actually the Commission on many occasions has encouraged contemporary additions to historic buildings. The adopted design guidelines for historic properties here in Geneva encourages additions to be discernible from the historic architecture of a property. That goal may be achieved in a variety of ways, including contemporary additions and or the use of contemporary materials. The overarching issue here is that a new addition should be identifiable from a historic building. The idea that it should match and blend perfectly or follow all the same original details is not the objective of the Commission. The Commission does review projects for architectural compatibility based on scale, alignment of elements, massing, materials, and a variety of other architectural and visual qualities. Furthermore, additions should be designed so that if removed in the future, the essential form and features of the historic property would be left unimpaired from their original condition. Does the Commission review accessory structures such as garden sheds, garages, or gazebos? Again, yes, only if the proposed accessory structure requires a building permit and is visible from the right-of-way. Are alterations of the rear of my property subject to Commission review? Again, only work that is proposed by a property owner and that requires a building permit and that is visible from the public right-of-way is subject to Commission review. Therefore, in most cases, proposed work at the rear of a building is not subject to commission review. In certain instances, there are properties that have nearly 360-degree visible access from public right-of-ways. In those cases, work at the rear of the building may be reviewed by the commission. Will commission review significantly increase approval times for proposed work at a designated property? Each year, approximately 150 proposed projects within the Geneva Historic District are reviewed on behalf of the Historic Preservation Commission. Approximately 80% of those cases, or about 120 a year, are approved administratively by myself as staff within 2 to 4 weeks as part of the routine building permit review process. Staff is available to work with property owners prior to a submittal for a building permit to be reviewed by the commission. Staff can provide guidance to applicants and their design team to guide projects towards compliance with adopted design standards and policies. Additionally, many applicants choose to take advantage of a concept review meeting before the commission, which is designed to be an informal exchange of ideas at a preliminary stage so that the applicant will receive design feedback prior to submitting final drawings for a building permit application. Approximately 20% of the proposed projects, or roughly 30 cases annually, are heard before the full Preservation Commission, which is a commission of volunteers, and it's composed of 7 residents of Geneva. The commission meets once each month on the 3rd Tuesday at 7 o'clock here in this room. Of those cases being reviewed for building permit application, approximately 95% are approved by the commission within a single meeting. Commission approval may be subject to minor project refinements, modifications, or clarifications that are resolved there at the meeting, so the permit can be processed in short order. Annually, less than 1% of projects subject to commission review have been appealed to the City Council for reversal of a commission determination. Typically, in the last 4 years, it's been 1 case or less that has appealed a decision of the commission to the City Council. Does historic designation eliminate the possibility of subdividing large properties into smaller lots? As I said earlier, historic preservation does not negate the zoning rights that go along with a parcel. So therefore, historic designation itself does not prevent the subdivision of larger lots within the city of Geneva. Subdivision of existing parcels, however, must comply with zoning regulations that include lot frontage along a public street, lot area, setbacks, etc. Additionally, zoning and building regulations govern the size and massing of new construction, including lot coverage, building height, and building area. New construction at properties designated as historic is reviewed by the Historic Preservation Commission based on the building and zoning regulations, and then is reviewed further for architectural compatibility with the surrounding neighborhood buildings and site, which includes the review of building mass, size, scale, alignment of elements, details, materials, and setting. Does historic designation increase my taxes? Historic designation is not a factor in the calculation of real estate taxes, which are based on the value of the land and buildings. However, historically designated properties are eligible for a tax assessment freeze based on the completion of qualified rehab expenditures that qualify with the Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation. Once approved rehabilitation work is completed, the tax assessment freeze program suspends a property's tax assessment at current levels for a period of 8 years, increasing incrementally to a full assessment over the next 4 years. That tax assessment freeze program is administered by the State Preservation Office and is available only to communities that qualifies at what's called a certified local government, which Geneva qualifies for that, that benefit. The tax assessment freeze program has been used quite extensively here in Geneva for the rehab of historic properties. Can a building within a historic district be demolished? Potentially. The Historic Preservation Commission is charged with preserving the authentic character of Geneva's historic neighborhoods. Therefore, the Commission seeks to work with property owners to prevent the demolition of contributing and significant properties within designated neighborhoods. Consequently, Geneva's code enforcement officer and myself work closely on property maintenance concerns in the community to minimize cases of demolition by neglect. When a property is proposed for demolition, the Commission seeks to find alternatives to demolition that allows for the continued use of a property while protecting the community's heritage. Requests for demolition are reviewed at a public hearing, so it is open to public comment from concerned neighbors and residents throughout the community. When demolition has not been possible, or when the Commission has not been able to find a potential for reuse, demolition does occur within historic neighborhoods. Will a property be more difficult to sell in the future because it is located within a historic district? This is a difficult question. You will find real estate professionals debating this issue back and forth. Realtors both locally and nationally disagree on whether or not historic designation makes historic properties more or less desirable. However, typically, buildings that are designated as historic have held their value, and property values increase more rapidly in historic neighborhoods than in similar neighborhoods that are not designated. Certainly, there are a lot of factors that are associated with resale value for a property and why people consider or not consider purchasing a property. Some of those that we hear on a regular basis are proximity to schools, mass transit, or dining and shopping opportunities, a location along a busy roadway, accessibility to recreational amenities, the overall neighborhood character, the level of real estate taxes in a particular neighborhood, personal lifestyle choices, crime statistics, affordability, and the list goes on and on. So what are the benefits of historic district designation? I've identified or summarized 10 basic benefits here this evening. The first one is buying into a local historic district with reasonable design standards is typically a good investment. As I mentioned earlier, properties within local historic districts appreciate at rates greater than the local market overall, as well as faster than similar non-designated neighborhoods. Findings on this point are consistent across the United States, and the trend has been consistent for over 5 decades regarding historically designated properties. A 2007 study by a historic preservation officer in Tempe, Arizona found that property values increased by 5% to 35% more in historic districts over areas with similar homes. Moreover, recent analysis shows that historic districts are also less vulnerable to market volatility from interest rate fluctuations and economic downturns. Preservation encourages local economic job growth, which is good for business. Historic preservation creates positive economic benefits and jobs. According to a study prepared by the Delaware Division of Historical and Cultural Affairs in 2010, for every $1 million spent on rehabilitation in a community, 14.6 jobs are created in that community. Rehabilitation offers a higher return on investment in terms of job creation than new construction or manufacturing, and preservation work depends more heavily on the work of skilled craftsmen than the purchase of raw materials. Therefore, across the building industry, in comparison to new construction, preservation more directly benefits local business. Preservation also complements place-based economic development. Historic districts can positively impact the local economy through tourism. An aesthetically cohesive and well-promoted district can be a community's most important attraction. I think most people agree that that is one of the things that attracts most of the out-of-town visitors to Geneva is its historic character and charm, along with the shopping and dining opportunities that are available. According to a 2009 report, 78% of all U.S. leisure travelers are cultural and/or heritage travelers who spent on average $994 on their most recent trips, compared to $611 spent by non-cultural and heritage travelers. Protecting local historic districts can enhance business recruitment potential. For those of you who are interested in having a solid business environment in your community, vibrant commercial core and charming neighborhoods with character attract new business and quality industry. Companies continually relocate to communities that offer their workers a higher quality of life, which successful preservation programs and stable historic districts enhance. Typically, more affluent home buyers seek communities with a strong economic base. Financial incentives are available to historically designated and protected properties. Certain rehabilitation grants are available only to individual historic landmarks or to contributing or significant properties within a designated historic district. Those properties that are located within a certified local government community, which Geneva is, or listed in the National Register of Historic Places have greater access to the available grant funding. In Illinois, properties that undergo approved rehabilitation programs can apply for the tax assessment freeze, which I spoke of earlier, which limits future tax assessments at the prehabilitation rate for 8 years. While not available for most residential properties, a federal rehabilitation tax credit and a new state rehabilitation tax credit are available for those properties that are income producing. Designation helps attract like-minded investment, public sector funding, and publicity that will encourage the ongoing preservation of the history and architecture of a distinctive area. People who are attracted to historic homes typically want to be assured that they are investing in a community with similar values and ideas. Designated neighborhoods provide assurance that the area will largely remain the same over time, lessening worries about how a neighborhood may change negatively due to demolition and insensitive new construction, which may have a negative impact on future investment. Living in the midst of a community that is consciously wrestling with the same issues, problems, and goals can be very helpful. Where a local historic district requires compliance with design guidelines, property owners have access to resources and expertise through its Historic Preservation Commission and knowledgeable staff. Typically, locally designated districts encourage better quality design. Often people who purchase homes in historic areas want to do the right thing, but they may not be sure what that means. Every neighborhood experiences the occasional property owner who lapses into bad judgment, and some owners may just be uninformed about what is appropriate, while others may want to deliberately dispense with tradition in favor of their own need for convenience, comfort, or extravagance. Specifically, the inappropriate building additions are prohibited when a neighborhood is designated historic and subject to design review. Also, properties designated as historic are preserved as products of their own time, creating a record of the architectural heritage of both the local Geneva community as well as the United States. Better quality design results in a greater sense of neighborhood cohesiveness, more innovative use of materials, and greater public appeal, all of which are shown to occur more often within designated districts than in non-designated areas. Preservation conserves natural resources. Restoring older commercial and residential buildings is environmentally responsible. Historic preservation as a form of infill development provides usable and attractive buildings on land that is already developed and diverts construction waste from landfills. Heritage conservation helps reduce reliance on new materials, environmentally unfriendly building materials, and energy-intensive production of new building materials. Many features of historic structures, such as awnings, overhangs, and shutters, are designed to take advantage of natural light to enhance energy efficiency. Historic districts are a vehicle for education. Historic neighborhoods and the buildings in them are a tangible link to the past and a way to bring meaningful history to people's lives on a daily basis. Preserved places maintain the original character of buildings and streets while welcoming growth and innovation within those places. Historic properties are meant to be a living, active record of communities, their residents, and their progression over time. We can't forget that preservation itself can just be plain fun and interesting. Digging into the history of an area, particularly an individual residence, may provide some stories worth repeating to the next generation. And as stewards of our collective heritage, owners of historic properties provide an important link between past and future generations. Local districts give communities a voice in their future. By participating in the designation process, citizens can help direct their community's path to the future. Making these decisions together in a structured way rather than behind closed doors or without public comment or input gives everyone involved a sense of empowerment and confidence. Neighbors can actually express their opinions about how a historically designated neighborhood evolves. Since major changes are approved by the Historic Preservation Commission in a public setting, concerns about proposed alterations within a neighborhood can be expressed by the neighbors most affected. It is honorable to serve as a steward of our collective past. For many people who live in historic properties, one of the greatest benefits is very personal, satisfaction as a good steward of an important place for a short time in history. Many historic property owners enjoy the comfort of knowing the history of a place, its residents, and the events that have occurred in a particular place will be preserved. Historic home ownership means adding an individual story to a growing history of a place. Knowing that a historic property is designated and protected for the future assures that those stories and knowledge will live on in the memory of future stewards. So, what is the probable review timeline for the proposed South Geneva Historic District? The nomination, as I said, was filed on November 21st, 2018. The notice of filing was distributed. It was required to be distributed not later than December 14th, 2018. Staff review was completed in a timely manner and was returned to the nominators on December 19th of 2018. The public information meeting, which we're having this evening, was by ordinance was to be scheduled between December 26th and January 7th. Some people have questioned the January 3rd date, and it's actually set by ordinance as to when we can hold that. Nomination revisions are due not later than 5 p.m. on February 4th, 2019. That's an important date and deadline for the nominators, because if they fail to return the revisions that are required by February 4th, 2019, the nomination is automatically withdrawn and dies at that point. So the nomination revisions need to be returned in a timely manner. The public hearing will be scheduled at the next regular meeting of the Historic Preservation Commission, which will possibly be as early as February 19th, but more likely March 19th. The public hearing is scheduled based on the return of the revisions and the legal requirements to notify the general public about the public hearing. There are notification requirements that are set by law, and those need to be followed once we get the revisions back. I apologize for this little glitch. As I mentioned earlier, the public hearing can be continued to a date certain, but the commission must act on the nomination within 45 days of closing the public hearing. At that time, the commission recommendation will be forwarded to the city council, and the city council must review and take action within 60 days of the Historic Preservation Commission's nomination or determination, I'm sorry. So at this point, I know some of you have questions. I've been asking them to be kept to the end. At this point, I would entertain questions that have not been answered in this evening's presentation, and do my best to answer those questions at this time. So, yes?
In the preservation plan, there's a section near the end listing what you call resources, which is a list of houses that are, I guess, what exactly does that mean? Are those houses that you're interested in, or?
Okay. The question that was asked was, in the preservation plan, which is this document here, there is an appendix that identifies potentially historic properties, historic resources. Those were properties that were identified back in 2008 as warranting further study as to whether or not they could be determined as historically significant properties or listed as a landmark. There is no action being taken on them individually. This was a list that was compiled as just other properties that should be looked at some point in the future back in 2008.
So if the property owner, or if one of those is our neighbor, we can convince them to become part of this, would that, part of this historic district, would that, amend it to include that property, would that potentially hold up the whole process? Or would it be better
If a property owner wanted to join the process that's in process now, they could make that known through the public hearing, and then the commission would have to evaluate whether or not that was a path they wanted to follow. If they said, yes, it makes sense that it's contiguous and it follows the basic information that's provided in the nomination, that would be probably one of the reasons that the commission would then continue the public hearing to allow time to gather that information, include that in the nomination.
Good question.
Yes.
Is there anything that can be done to protect that property for the time being, so some builder doesn't come in and rip it down and put up two McMansions on the two lots that it covers?
If it's not protected, there is nothing, or designated as a historic property, there's nothing the Historic Preservation Commission can do, so it would be subject to the zoning regulations that are allowed for that particular property. So it could be applied for a demolition permit, which again has no review if it's not a designated property, and then would just have to comply with the regulations for that parcel. So in short, there is no guarantee to the specific question or concern you had. Yes, Charlie.
What type of revisions to the district are you requesting?
I did not bring that full list down here tonight. It's about I think about 16 or 17 page document. Much of it is refinement of consistency from one element to another. So for instance, the period of significance for the district, I was suggesting that it should be maybe lengthened to accommodate all of the information that was provided. There are some grammatical errors. There's some consistency of describing buildings. For instance, some buildings are described with their roof material, their siding material, windows. Others don't have that information, so we'd like that to be consistent across the board. So it's mostly housekeeping type of items. There was nothing, there was not a major omission in the document as submitted. Did that answer your question? Okay.
Housekeeping, basically.
Yes, it was basically housekeeping. Yes. Sorry, I'm going to go around the room if I can.
Two things real quick. You mentioned the public hearing, and then it goes to the Historic Preservation Commission?
No, the Preservation Commission actually holds the public hearing, so that will be before the
Okay,
Preservation
public
Commission.
hearing. But when it goes to the city council, and of course it would go to the committee of the whole first, I presume.
No, it does. The way the ordinance is written, the recommendation of the Historic Preservation Commission would go directly to the City Council, not to the Committee of the Whole.
Okay, understood. The other thing is the very common misconception of what you can do in terms of renovations in a historically, in a significant structure. And I would like for you to comment on what can or cannot be done in terms of interior modification. What regulations?
Again, as far as the local regulation goes, the Historic Preservation Commission only reviews what is visible from the public right-of-way, so essentially exteriors. The tax assessment freeze program I mentioned that is available to properties in Geneva because we are a certified local government. That program is administered by the State Preservation Office. They do have requirements for certain elements of interiors to be restored to comply, or be rehabilitated, not restored necessarily, to be rehabilitated according to the Secretary of Interior standards to meet that tax assessment freeze requirement. But locally, we do not review interiors whatsoever.
Okay, so but on the state level, that would only apply if you are looking for the tax freeze.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. And there was a question. Okay, we'll start the second row, and then we'll work our way around.
Oh,
Yep, in the red.
I just wanted to clarify, somebody had asked about whether or not demolition could happen at, I assume you're referring to the Atwater property. I know in your presentation you said no building permits can be issued while this is being reviewed.
Right.
But demolition permits can be issued?
No, a demolition permit is a form of a building permit.
Okay, so the house cannot be demolished while this is being reviewed either. Nothing will happen to any of the properties in the proposed zone while it's being considered?
Correct.
Okay. And the changes to the revisions, that will be
Yes, yes. Mhm. Is that all your questions? Right for now? Okay.
Is the voting, you said that if, as long as fewer than 20% of the people in the district are opposed, it just requires a simple majority in city council. Are the votes by houses in the district or parcel numbers, or how many votes are in this proposed district right now?
Okay. Votes is kind of a misnomer, so I want to clear that up. It's not a voting or tallying of objection or not objecting. It is a count of the parcels in the district. So there are some properties that are made up of multiple tax parcels. So it's if 20% of the owners of those parcels object, then it would require a supermajority. If less than 20% of those parcels object, then it would just be a simple majority.
And how many parcels are in the district right now?
I didn't commit my memory, that to memory, but there are 20 properties, and I believe there are, don't quote me on this, but I think there are 24 or 25. I don't remember for sure. I did not bring that down. I apologize.
Thank you. I just want to understand that process.
That's what this means exactly for. So I want to answer all the questions that come up. So don't apologize. Yes.
I have two questions, and one kind of piggybacks on yours, because I still am not quite grasping that. But number one, is the slideshow going to be available online for people who can come and see?
Yes, it will be available. Most likely it will be up on the website tomorrow, and this is being video recorded, so it will also be streamed through our Geneva broadcast network.
The other question I have is, the whole voting thing, I guess I'm still, there are 20 properties in there, who are the other 6? Like, for instance, I'm adjacent to, or next to the line.
Right.
I have no say, my opinion doesn't matter. I guess I'm wondering, does it matter, does it not? Do I have any input? Or,
Your opinion certainly does matter. The count as far as how the city council would be required to vote either with a simple majority or two-thirds majority is based on those properties within the boundaries of the district. And then as far as the other part of your question, where are the other 6 from? Again, I'll try to explain this. Some properties are made up of multiple parcels and have multiple tax parcels. So there are a couple that are 2 or 3 parcels in their property. Oh, you're welcome. I'm going to hold you for a second because I think there was somebody back here had a question, or if not, I'll take this gentleman first, let everybody get one chance. Yes?
My impression that the properties that are in the district as laid out right now are people that have volunteered to be in it, so all are in favor of it. That's not the case?
No, that is not necessarily the case. The majority of the properties are voluntary. There are some properties that were included because they were necessary to provide contiguity between the historic landmark properties and other properties to the south. So if I can go back to, let's see, what's the easiest way to go back to that map? So I want to go back to the landmark map if you'll let me. So as I said, a historic district must include at least one historic landmark property. So these properties identified in orange are the 2 existing historic landmarks in this neighborhood. So all the properties must be contiguous to those landmark properties to be included in the historic district. So for instance, if, and I don't have a pointer here, but if a property in the center of the proposed district were to be removed or disconnected from the district, that could eliminate all those properties south of that from being connected to the historic landmark. So therefore, they would not be eligible to be included in the district. So contiguity is an important characteristic of a historic district.
Yes, it prevented me from joining, I wanted to.
So yes, sometimes, yes, I know there were several people who were interested in joining and could not get a connection to the proposed boundaries. So, is that answer your question? Okay. Yes.
Yes, so I'm a little unclear based on that. Are there any people within the historic district that have
Yes, the nomination clearly identifies that, at the time of the filing, two of the properties were being sold. That owner did not, I don't believe, did not reply in either case, but I have since heard from one of the purchasers of that property that they are not in favor of the historic district.
So just to complete the circle of that question, in theory, a group of people could surround people who don't want to be in the historic district and force them to be in the district?
Yes, in theory, and that is very typical of zoning, other zoning law, that districts typically don't have donut holes of non-complying or non-conforming properties within a zoning district. So that's the same principle that's being applied to a historic district. Okay, all of a sudden a bunch of hands went up, so, okay, I'll take yours, now I'll come back here.
This is similar to annexations. If you have a area with the city surrounding the blob of property that is not in the district, or not within the city, they can be annexed just because of the continuity of the previously annexed. That's correct, right?
Yes, essentially, yes. Okay, I'm gonna go back, I'm gonna work my way around the room if I can. Yes,
Yeah, and I think the map would have helped here,
Oh.
but you were talking about the continuous layout of the district. However, we're being included in this when our home is actually like around an L-shaped lot. So us being excluded from this would have no barriers to the other properties.
let me go back to that for a second here. Bear with me.
The investors hold off an L-shaped lot outside of our property, so the property behind us is actually not included on this.
I've talked with you on the phone, I'm assuming, okay. So yes, that particular property, if that was pulled out, it appears that there would still be contiguity. We don't know if there's other people objecting or not. So until that's all sorted out in the public hearing, we're unclear as to whether contiguity could or could not be achieved if your property was not included. I'm not trying to be evasive, but that's the kind of information that comes out in the public hearing.
If we object prior to, can the rest of this still fall into place without us having to go into this?
The objection would be filed and would be part of the public record and would be part of what the Historic Preservation Commission would consider.
But based upon the amount of votes they've already gotten in their favor, we could be pushed into this outside of our favor.
Potentially, again, that's not from my decision, that's for the commission to decide, but potentially the answer is yes.
Does the commission have the ability to say, we will accept the district but with modifications?
Yes,
Or does the city council have to approve it as proposed?
I should be repeating these questions, I apologize. The question is, can the commission make modifications? The commission typically makes modifications where they deem it appropriate and necessary on any case that comes before it, and that would be the same case with the district. That's one of their charges, is to analyze all of the information presented at the public hearing through testimony and then make an evaluation of what is the appropriate recommendation to make to the city council. So it can be recommended to be approved as presented. It can be recommended to be approved with alterations and modifications. It can be approved for not being, it can be recommended to not be designated.
And can the city council also make changes to it, or just the commission?
The city council can make changes within the guidelines of the establishment of a historic district. So it can't be an arbitrary determination. It has to be something that follows the guidelines that are laid out for the standards for review. Okay. Yes, again, sir.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm just confused on it, and I apologize for not understanding. So, as I understand it, it's, the reason this is taking place is because there's a lot of consent around owners of properties wanting to join the historic district. In today's notice, you list a variety of homes that are included, but just so I'm clear, there are going to be homes
Correct. Right now, as submitted, there are 2 properties that may or may not want to be in one. Again, I can't remember names this evening, don't want to call you out, but one I've heard from, the other one we haven't heard from as to whether or not they want to be included. And the answers to that will have an impact on how the district boundaries are reviewed by the commission.
To finish the thought, obviously included, so a group of people have decided that they would like something designated historic and banded together and chosen that a group of powerful elite people who own historic homes have decided that one particular person or 2 particular people should be included, notwithstanding their own decision.
I don't want to put words in the nominator's mouth. What I have understood from working with them since July is that their goal was to involve as many people voluntarily as possible and trying to find contiguity to the historic landmarks. So that is what eventually led to these, the nomination boundaries that were submitted. So, but I'm not going to speak for what any intent was by a nominator. Okay, I'm going to go to this side of the room. I'm going to start in the very back and move forward. So all the back row.
I think it dovetails off of that last question.
Okay.
Or the very first question I was asked, which is, if this district is decided on, I don't think you ever answered the very first question, which is, does the homeowner who's adjacent, do they say, no, I don't want that, or is, once they're nominated, after this thing happens, if they're nominated, do they just automatically come in? Or is these boundaries set in stone, it's done, and it's up to the homeowner whether they want to be in it or not in the future?
Okay. I think there's 3 questions in there, so I'll try to answer the 3 parts. An adjacent homeowner or property owner can speak for or against the district. They're not an impacted property owner, so it's probably not their testimony will probably have a lesser weight than those people who are actually within the boundaries of the district. Not that it won't have any impact whatsoever, but it will probably have a lesser weight with the commission, the city council, than those who are actually within the boundaries. So that's the adjacent property owner. You're looking like.
Adjacent property owner has the ability to not be in it.
An adjacent property owner is not in the district.
So it's not in here.
Right, an adjacent is next to, so they're not in it. So you have to be within the district boundaries to, the district can grow. Any historic district, the boundaries can be modified, again, through a public hearing process. But again,
There are at least 24 votes in this in favor. And if those people decided they wanted to expand the district over the objection of adjacent homeowners, they could, with your annex theory, annex 5 to 7 other properties without needing a supermajority in city council.
well, no, that's not necessarily correct.
I'm clearly not
Right. So again, when the group came for me in July, their original goal was to only include as few non-consenting properties as possible to get the district there, to get a district established. If a non-consenting person were to be brought in against their will, as you're kind of outlined there, that would then potentially throw the numbers off for a vote in front of the city council to approve the boundary changes. So to bring in non-consenting properties after a district may be established serves no purpose. It would really be only to everyone's best interest to bring in other property owners who are trying to get contiguous. Now, as this gentleman said, he would like to be in the district, but he couldn't get contiguity. If he can talk a neighbor into saying, would you go in because I want to have this benefit, then that owner may be forced in, maybe against their will or just indifferent into the district. But just going out and trying to randomly pull properties in it doesn't build a strong case for expanding the boundaries in front of the Preservation Commission or the City Council.
There are other landmark properties in the area outside of this district.
Sure. There are people who have talked to me over the last few years who are very close to this property, who have inquired about landmarking their property. I can think of at least 3 right now. But they are not contiguous to this proposed district at this point, so they couldn't pursue that unless they could convince somebody in between them to be willing to amend the boundaries at a later date.
Right, so just, I'm still not, you're saying if there's something, for instance, you said you want to be part of it, but you couldn't get continuity. With the number of people in the district, if there's, say, one or two people between a property that wants to be part of it and the district, you're telling me that it is impossible to make those people that would create the contiguity join?
It's not impossible. It's highly unlikely because when you look at what the cost, the process, and then trying to convince the city council that 50% of the people don't want to be in it who want to expand the boundary, the logical side of me says that probably wouldn't.
The only people who are considered by city council are the properties that would be expanded, not the properties already in the district?
Correct.
So they would be the adjacent.
Correct. If they were asking to if they're asking to come into the district because they could gain contiguity, yes.
But an owner outside of the historic district can still apply to landmark their own property.
Correct. Any property.
It then comes under the same regulations as all the houses in the district.
Yes, that's why we have 5 individual landmark properties down in this area already, because they chose to individually landmark their property outside of a district. Yes.
Yeah, okay. I want to go back and just a detailed question about the voting procedure. Let me just get the numbers exactly straight.
Okay.
There are 26 properties within this district? 26. You didn't want to say votes,
Right.
but voices.
I believe there are 20 parcels, or 20 properties, and of those 20 properties, I believe it's either 24 or 26 parcels.
26 parcels.
Mhm.
20 of them need to vote yes.
No. The property owners are not voting. The information that's being submitted to the Preservation Commission and then forwarded to the City Council says this many are this many parcels have signed and said they're in favor. This many have signed and said they've objected. That information gets taken to the Commission for consideration, and then once it gets recommended to City Council, depending on where those numbers fall, either the City Council can vote.
Okay, so
But-
what is the cutoff for supermajority? 20% or 20 parcels? I'm sorry.
20% of the parcels must file an objection.
The default is to not file. You don't say anything, you haven't filed.
Correct. If you don't file an objection correctly, it's invalid.
So if one of the properties on the very edge, can this red line that you've drawn be changed without starting all over again? So if one of the properties on the very edge wanted to opt out, and you could change the little red line and him opting out wouldn't affect the vote.
That would be a determination made by the Historic Preservation Commission after hearing all the testimony, if they wanted to alter the boundaries based on what the testimony.
Before it goes to the city.
Correct. And that would be a complete recommendation and made to the City Council. Okay? Yes.
I have a statement rather than a question. I renovated 2 houses, historical homes. One's a Geneva landmark. The other one was 1101, you saw a picture of earlier on Batavia Avenue. I had no issue ever. And I did a lot of work on both of those houses. 113 Fulton, which was in the historic district, and 1101. Just recently, I'm on my 3rd one, so I'm sort of like a Windy City rehab Geneva girl here. I did 464 Easton, where we tore off Arbor Drive it. That is not a historical home, not in a historic district. And I went through the ringer, getting just minor modification. I'm then telling you, the historical thing was not an issue. I put on roofs, I did porches, I did inside, outside, front, back, and over. But the porch on 464 Easton was by far more difficult than any of the others that I did in the historical district on historical homes. So if that's any help at all, just know that it's not some big scary thing. On 113 that's what I can afford to do. I said I had a choice between doing that and getting the squirrels out of my yard. No, that's how bad this house was. They were totally reasonable, and they said that makes sense. You know, my architect, Steve Vasilian, would tell you the same thing. Everybody is really, you know, there's been some horror stories, but I'm living proof. 2 big restorations, one in the historic district, one that I landmarked and created the problem for myself, if you want to call it that. And it was both went without any problem at all. So I just want to throw that out there because it was just it was a beautiful experience. And while we're here, I'll also tell you that I'm leaving Geneva on my way to the Bay Area July 1st. And I want to tell you that they are so good at protecting the local, the landmark areas and the historical areas. I am now in a new house. I was in the older houses. I think they did a beautiful job in the historical district when they built those row houses over there by the stone. New stuff and changes are gonna happen. You know, I'm not one of those butch rockers screaming, don't, you know, change anything, ladies. I'm not. New things and new construction is gonna happen. But when they have oversight, it's just so much more seamless in the community. And it's beautiful. You're gonna end up with some very strange, bad taste buildings. And you'll regret it if you don't go this route. That's the biggest reason it's for the new construction in Franklin. It's not the existing. I'm sorry, I don't mean to preach, but I'm leaving and I get some vested interest in this community that you get it right.
Thank you. Are there other questions about this? Yes.
Could I amplify that a little bit? We have lost so many houses in our neighborhood, and they're being replaced with these horrible.
Modern architecture.
Modern no, it's not even, it's non-architectural. They're inappropriate houses, they're cookie cutter mansions, and they're destroying the neighborhood. I can judge because if you go to any architectural website, these are the houses that they make fun of. I'm sorry. And we just lost a house that was architecturally significant. It was designed by an architect and built in 1949. It was over 2 lots, and now it's gone, and they're building 2 nondescript houses. They're squeezing them in on these 2 parcels that this house was on, and, you know,
So,
yeah. So, I just wanted to, you know, this is to protect all of us, in my opinion.
well, and I appreciate those comments. I am going to ask that we keep opinion and comment to the public hearing because that's really kind of the appropriate place to offer opinion. But I am here to answer as many questions about the process and about the nomination at this point as possible. So if there's other questions, yes.
Just a
Colin.
clarification, Mr. Lambert. In an historic district, you mentioned the 3 classifications, non-contributing, contributing, and significant. It's my understanding that a non-contributing house is not subject to review by the HPC, is that correct?
A non-contributing property is subject to review, but it's a very minimal level of review. Again, looking at compatibility of materials and, you know, there's a lot of different things that can be proposed to a non-contributing property that could affect a historic district.
What is the criteria for a property to be contributing or significant?
A significant property is one that is almost virtually intact architecturally to its period of construction or to its significant period. For instance, it may have had a major remodeling at some point that was significant because of who designed it or who built it or who it was built for, or is intact in relationship to a specific historic event that has meaning for the community of Geneva. A contributing building, which again are the majority of the buildings in the current historic district, are those buildings that add general character to the neighborhood or support the overall feeling and character of the neighborhood, both architecturally and setting, and complement the actual significant and landmark buildings of a district. Yes?
As a reference to your last sentence you had there with the environment and its contribution to that historic area. One of my big concerns of the Atwater property, of that house and that square block there, is the significance of the bur oak trees there, the springs and the ravines there. And I was very shocked, well, I'm still surprised the city of Geneva does not factor into their control of things in our current historic district on First River Lane down there, where the bur oak is the only tree that withstood the prairie fires. They are antenna for the bird migrations along the Fox River. They're more important than me and what I want in my property. There were 3 giant 500-year-old bur oaks on the South River Lane where they tore down. It was a red brick house that was neglected, okay, and are now building ones just standing up mass and all over it. To me, one of the significant aspects of the Atwater house, its history of the springs there. The bur oak trees are healthy. They can be 3
Is
to
there a
700.
question?
Yeah.
The bur oak.
Is there a question
Is
there?
there a question?
Yes.
What is the question?
Yes, the question is, if it's important to factor in the environmental conditions of a property also, and give that significance, and that's what you just mentioned in a summary of your quote there.
Yes, the tree protection, tree preservation is not under the purview of the Historic Preservation Commission. So we do not have a heritage tree program. We don't have protection for trees on lots under a certain size. However, where there is vacant property and new construction is proposed, or an existing property where expansion of the property is proposed, the commission does have the ability to respond to site features that should be preserved or protected if they're identified as part of the landmark nomination. The proposed nomination does begin to address that this is that this area was a historic area with the rolling terrain and the springs and what have you. That does not mean that natural features can all be protected and preserved, but they certainly are taken into consideration with any proposal for renovation of these properties. Yes.
To the best of your knowledge, do you know if there are any grandfathered, quote-unquote, subdivisions of the properties currently?
I don't know that off the top of my head, so I would not want to answer that without looking at zoning. I mean, there's underlying subdivisions all through this area because the property has been subdivided multiple times over the years by different developers, and projects have been abandoned and replatted. So there are numerous underlying subdivisions, but whether any of them, I'm not exactly sure what the question is, but I don't think any of those have an impact on the nomination that's presented.
Whatever I was presented was one of my neighbors has, I want to say 3 or 4 potential lots that they could chop off of there.
Well, again, subdivision is a zoning process that I would defer to our zoning, our planning department and our community development. But again, to subdivide a property, they have to meet the minimum standards for subdivision. So as I mentioned in the presentation, and just a short summary of some, there has to be a minimum lot area, there has to be a certain amount of street frontage, there has to be there's the setbacks are established for the district, so all those things have to be met. But again, that's a zoning issue, not a historic preservation issue. Yes, sir.
Michael, sorry,
Yes.
can you answer this?
Yes.
There are already satellite landmarks already designated.
Yes.
Why does this have to be a continuous line? Why can't they split up into, for instance, this new one, why can't this be split up into
Sure. There is nothing dictated by the commission as to how a district boundary is formed. All we require is they meet those regulations. So my understanding is the process that has occurred is that it was basically a neighbor-to-neighbor initiative. Now, again, I'm assuming you're, okay, together, okay. I know that you were purchasing the property when all this was going on. So, again, I don't even think you had closed officially or hadn't been recorded at least at the county's office when the nomination was filed. So, that property was included because it was kind of an unknown future for it. But there's nothing, the only thing that restricts the district is it must include at least 2 properties, and one of those properties has to be a historic landmark. So what was done was try to incorporate as many people who are interested. And like I said, there are people who have talked to me who were interested in being included in the district but could not get contiguous to the properties that were going in to the district. You're welcome. I've never been a contestant on Jeopardy, but I'm getting a feeling this is kind of what it feels like. So, yes, for question.
The map shows 2 properties that are already designated, right?
Correct.
This proposal would create the Atwater property as a designated property also? Is that part of it?
No, the proposal right now identifies contributing and non-contributing properties. The only significant properties identified in the nomination at this point are the 2 landmark properties. There's no special designation being requested or applied to any of the former Atwater parcels. Any other questions? It's your chance. I'm up here all by myself just waiting for a question. If not, I would like to thank you all for your coming tonight and your participation, and we'll keep you abreast of information.